Late May 1940, the beaches of Dunkirk, France. A freezing wind whips across the North Sea, carrying the acrid sense of salt, smoke, and burning oil. The channel horizon is a chaotic blur of gray water and gray sky. But the shoreline is a vision from a darker world. Stretching for miles, a desperate, shuffling multitude of British and French soldiers waits in ragged queues that snake into the surf. They are exhausted ghosts in uniform, their faces smeared with grime and soot. Above them, the air shudders with the scream of diving Stuka bombers and the crump of artillery shells throwing geysers of sand and seawater into the air. The sea itself is a graveyard of wrecked ships, their blackened superstructures tilting at grotesque angles. From a bunker complex hundreds of miles to the east, the architect of this calamity surveys his triumph. Maps show triumphant arrows of gray, the panzer divisions, that have sliced through the Allied armies in a matter of weeks. The message from the front is clear. The French army, once considered the finest in Europe, is shattered. The British Expeditionary Force is being driven into the sea. For Adolf Hitler, watching newsreels of the disorganized retreat, the conclusion is not merely military, but ideological. It is a validation. The democratic powers, soft, divided, and weak, are crumbling before the focused will of the National Socialist state. And across the Atlantic, a nation only just stirring from its isolationist slumber watches the disaster unfold in grim newspaper headlines. In Berlin, that distant power is dismissed with a contemptuous wave. A nation of shopkeepers, film stars, and car manufacturers. An army of untested boys led by businessmen. A joke. The stage is set for a collision between a dictator's profound miscalculation and an industrial colossus yet to awaken. Enter there, the United States that emerged from the mud and carnage of the Western Front in November 1918 possessed, for a fleeting moment, one of the most potent land armies on Earth. The American Expeditionary Forces under General John J. Pershing had swelled to over 2 million men. They had proven their mettle in the meat grinder offensives at Saint-Mihiel and the Meuse-Argonne. American industrial might had begun to tip the balance, supplying not just its own doughboys but its exhausted allies. The world had seen the latent power of the New World. Then, with stunning speed, America turned its back on it all. The nation plunged headlong into the era of the Roaring Twenties, a time defined by stock market speculation, prohibition, jazz, and a deep, pervasive war weariness. The costly intervention in Europe was widely viewed as a mistake, a bloody entanglement in the corrupt old world's perpetual squabbles. This sentiment crystallized into the hard policy of isolationism. The U.S. Senate's rejection of the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations in 1919-20 was not merely a political decision. It was a philosophical declaration of disengagement. The military consequences were immediate and severe. The vast army was demobilized with breakneck haste. Within 18 months, the force of millions had been reduced to a skeletal cadre of fewer than 140,000 men, a size mandated by the National Defense Act of 1920. This was not an army designed to project power or fight a peer adversary. Its primary missions became coastal defense and putting down domestic civil unrest. The U.S. Army ranked 17th in the world, behind Portugal and Greece. Funding evaporated. Throughout the 1920s and into the Depression-ravaged 1930s, the armed forces survived on budgetary scraps. Soldiers trained with wooden mock-ups of tanks and trucks. Artillery units used logs painted gray to simulate guns. The cavalry, still a prominent branch, debated the merits of the horse versus the machine, its leadership often clinging romantically to the former. He failed to see that an army free of Nazi dogma could be motivated by something equally potent, a belief in personal liberty, a desire to finish the job, and the fierce loyalty not to a Führer, but to the man in the foxhole next to him. Beyond racial ideology, Hitler's dismissiveness was rooted in what he considered a cold, logistical fact. The United States might possess vast industrial potential, but turning that potential into a fighting force on the European continent was a task of unimaginable complexity. One he was certain they could not accomplish in time. He and his military economists, like the influential Reichsbank President H. Hjalmar Schacht early on, viewed America's industrial might as a paper tiger, formidable on balance sheets, but irrelevant on the battlefield of the moment. The reasoning was twofold: time and conversion. German intelligence estimates, such as those compiled by the Abwehr, acknowledged America's colossal output in cars, refrigerators, and steel, but building tanks, bombers, and warships was a different discipline altogether. Retooling assembly lines from Ford Model S to M4 Sherman tanks, from washing machines to water-cooled machine guns, would take years, they believed. And time was the one commodity Hitler was convinced the Americans did not have. With Russia reeling after Operation Barbarossa and Britain isolated, the war in Europe would be decided long before American factories could meaningfully intervene. This perception was bolstered by the actual observable state of the U.S. military in 1941. When Hitler declared war on the U.S. on December 11, 1941, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, he was not reacting to a visible military threat. He was reacting to Roosevelt's undeclared naval war in the Atlantic and ideologically siding with his Japanese ally. The army he was tangentially committing to fight was, by European standards, a museum piece. The U.S. Army's standard infantry rifle was the superb Moen Garand, a genuine advantage. But beyond that, the arsenal was lacking. Its main tank was the M3 Stuart, a light tank nicknamed Honey by the British for its reliability, but armed with only a 37 May pop gun that German panzer crews would later derisively call the door knocker. Its medium tank, the M3 Lee Grant, was a tall, clumsy design with its main gun mounted in a limited traverse side sponson, a stopgap solution that was already obsolete upon arrival. American tank doctrine still largely saw armor as infantry support, not as an independent, decisive arm. In the air, the Army Air Forces flew the P-39 Airacobra and P-40 Warhawk, capable aircraft, but outclassed by the latest German Messerschmitt Bf-109s. More damningly, there was no strategic bomber force capable of reaching Germany from British bases. The B-17 Flying Fortress was in its infancy. There was no equivalent to the battle-hardened Luftwaffe. Most critically, the U.S. military had zero experience in large-scale combined arms operations. The Wehrmacht had perfected the orchestration of armor, infantry, artillery, and air power over 3 years of continental warfare. The U.S. Army had to learn this deadly symphony from scratch, under fire. To the German High Command, the OCW, sending this army against the veterans of France, Poland, and Russia seemed not risky, but absurd. It was like sending a spirited but untrained amateur into the ring with a champion. What Hitler failed to grasp, a failure of imagination as much as intelligence, was the American capacity for mass production not as a slow conversion, but as an explosive, unleashed force. He did not foresee the creation of the arsenal of democracy, where shipyards would build Liberty ships in 5 days, where the Willow Run plant would spit out a B-24 Liberator bomber every hour, and where tank production would soon dwarf that of the entire Axis combined. He saw the empty factory floors of 1941, not the ceaseless, roaring production lines of 1943. He saw the first clumsy models of weapons, not the iterative, rapid improvement cycle that would soon produce the P-51 Mustang, the M4 Sherman in ever-improving variants, and the atomic bomb. A dictator's misjudgment is only as durable as the information ecosystem that sustains it. Adolf Hitler's contempt for the U.S. Army was not merely a personal idiosyncrasy, it was an institutionalized belief, reinforced and rarely challenged within the closed loop of the Nazi command structure. This failure of intelligence was systemic, born of ideological corruption, bureaucratic incompetence, and a profound cultural blindness. The primary intelligence organ, the Abwehr under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, was a nest of contradictions. While Canaris himself grew increasingly skeptical of Nazi victory and would later be implicated in the July 20 plot, his organization's reporting on the United States was often fragmented and amateurish. Abwehr agents in America were few, frequently incompetent, and spectacularly compromised by the FBI and the Duquesne spy ring and other counterintelligence successes. The intelligence that did filter back to Berlin tended to focus on political divisions, isolationist sentiment, labor strikes, racial tensions, which confirmed the Nazi thesis of a weak, fractured society. The staggering behind-the-scenes mobilization of industry was less visible and thus underreported. More damningly, the intelligence apparatus that mattered most was not the Abwehr, but the SS Intelligence Service, the Sicherheitsdienst SD, under Reinhard Heydrich and later Ernst Kaltenbrunner. The SD was not an objective fact-finding body. It was an ideological weapon. Its role was to provide intelligence that confirmed Nazi dogma. Reports were filtered through the lens of racial theory and the Führerprinzip. Analysts who delivered assessments contradicting Hitler's instincts did not prosper. They risked being labeled defeatists or traitors. The system actively rewarded optimism and confirmation bias. This created a paralyzing echo chamber. Hitler's military adjutants, like the sycophantic General Alfred Jodl and the obsequious Field Marshal Wilhelm Keidel, became masters of telling the Führer what he wanted to hear. The catastrophic underestimation of Soviet resilience before Operation Barbarossa had gone unpunished in any meaningful way. In fact, dissenters had been sidelined. The same dynamic applied to America. When occasional, sober assessments did emerge, such as reports on the sheer scale of the U.S. shipbuilding program, they were dismissed by Hitler as impossible or the exaggerations of panic mongers. He famously relied more on his own intuition and reading of Karl May's romanticized Western novels about America than on stark intelligence summaries. The result was a strategic blindness of historic proportions. German planning for a war with America, which they had instigated, was non-existent. There was no fall case planned for the defense of Fortress Europe against a massive American-led invasion from the West. The assumption was that any landing attempt would be thrown back into the sea by the existing garrison forces, much as the disastrous Canadian raid at Dieppe in 1942 seemed to prove. The focus remained obsessively, fatally, on the Eastern Front. The Western Allies were seen as a secondary nuisance, a Luftkrieg air war, and a potential peripheral threat, but not as a land army capable of meeting and destroying the Wehrmacht in open combat. February 14, 1943, the Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The landscape is a brutal expanse of rock, dust, and scrawny scrub, dominated by jagged passes cutting through the dorsal mountains. Here, the U.S. Army II Corps, green, overconfident, and poorly deployed, meets the veterans of General Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps and the 10th Panzer Division. The result is a masterclass in applied blitzkrieg and a near rout for the Americans. Rommel, seizing an opportunity, unleashes a coordinated assault of panzers and mechanized infantry, German Mark IV, and Tiger tanks, with their superior armor and high-velocity 75 Me and 88 from guns, easily outrange and obliterate the lighter American M3 Stuarts and Lees. The close air support the Americans expect is absent. Communications break down in the chaotic retreat. Confused and dispirited units fall back in disarray, abandoning equipment and positions. The pass is overrun. At Sidi Bouzid and elsewhere, American battalions are surrounded and destroyed. In Berlin, the reports confirm the existing narrative. The Judean army is folding under real pressure, just as predicted. But within this American disaster lay the seeds of the German miscalculation. The defeat was not due to a lack of courage in the individual soldier, but to inexperience, faulty tactics, and fragmented command. And the American system demonstrated a ruthless, pragmatic capacity for adaptation that Nazi ideology could not comprehend. Within days, command of II Corps was given to a new general, a hard-faced, relentlessly energetic officer named George S. Patton. He found a shaken force. His remedy was not racial inspiration, but brutal, professional discipline. He enforced saluting, polished uniforms, and a relentless offensive spirit. More crucially, the material response was immediate. New M4 Sherman tanks began to arrive. Improved artillery coordination was drilled. Anti-tank guns were deployed in new, more effective ways. Just weeks after Kasserine, a reorganized and re-energized II Corps, now fighting alongside seasoned British units, stopped the German offensive cold at the Battle of El Getter. Patton's men, using improved tactics and their reliable, quickly produced Shermans, defeated a combined German-Italian assault. The lesson was learned, and it was learned fast. June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach, Normandy. The pre-invasion intelligence briefings for German commanders in France had downplayed the threat. The Atlantic Wall was believed to be formidable. The troops manning it, however, were a mixed bag. Static infantry divisions filled with older men or Ostropien, conscripts from the east, with limited mobile reserves. The prevailing belief in Otibwa headquarters was that any landing would be bloodily repulsed on the beaches. At dawn on D-Day, this belief was subjected to the terrible impersonal mathematics of Allied naval gunfire and aerial bombardment. At Omaha, where the U.S. 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions landed, the bombardment had failed to neutralize the defenses. German machine gun nests and artillery positions embedded in the bluffs raked the landing craft with horrifying fire. The sea turned red. Men drowned under the weight of their packs. Pinned on the shingle, leaderless and terrified, the situation teetered on the brink of catastrophe. From a distant bunker, it might have looked like Kasserine on a larger scale, the soft Americans breaking against the wall of German defense. But then, something happened that defied the Nazi paradigm of racial ideological collapse. Small groups of survivors, bereft of officers, began to organize themselves. Engineers, under withering fire, used Bangalore torpedoes to blast gaps in the wire. Rangers, using grapples and ropes, began to scale the cliffs at Point Du Hoc to silence the guns that threatened the fleet. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers, lieutenants and sergeants, took charge, rallying handfuls of men from different units. They used the one advantage they had: relentless, close-in naval gunfire support directed by brave forward observers. They inched forward, blowing bunkers with grenades and flamethrowers. By afternoon, they had clawed their way off the beach and begun to take the bluffs from the rear. It was not a triumph of fanatical ideology, but of small unit initiative, adaptive courage, and sheer dogged persistence, qualities Hitler's worldview had not assigned to them. The shock in the German high command was palpable. The paper tiger had not only crossed the Atlantic Ocean, but had stormed a fortified coast and secured a lodgment. The echo chamber had produced a catastrophic intelligence failure. As Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, now commanding Army Group B in France, had warned, if we don't manage to throw them back in the first 24 hours, the invasion has succeeded. The 24 hours had passed. The Americans were not leaving. The entire premise of their contempt was now facing its ultimate field test in the close confines of the Normandy bocage. December 16, 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium, Luxembourg. Dawn breaks not with light, but with a thunderous, earth-shaking roar. A massive artillery barrage, the largest the Wehrmacht has launched since 1941, erupts along an 80-mile front. From the mist and snow of the dense, hauntingly familiar Ardennes Forest, 3 German armies, spearheaded by the 5th and 6th Panzer Armies, burst forth. Watch on the Rain is underway. Its objective is audacious, a final apocalyptic gamble. Split the Allied front, seize the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. The plan is built upon the last vestiges of Hitler's contempt. The sector is held thinly by the U.S. First Army, its units a mix of weary veterans and fresh, untested divisions sent to what was considered a quiet area to recuperate. German commanders, briefed by the Führer himself, are told the Americans lack strategic flexibility, that their morale is brittle, that a sharp, shocking blow will send them reeling into a chaotic retreat reminiscent of 1940. The initial attack targets the weakest seams, achieving almost complete surprise. Panzer columns led by the massive, nearly invulnerable King Tiger tanks crush isolated outposts. At places like Lanzerath, small groups of American engineers and intelligence and reconnaissance troops are overwhelmed. The offensive creates a deep, ominous bulge in the Allied lines. For a moment, in the Führerbunker, it seems the old intuition was right. But then, across the snow-blanketed front, a different reality asserts itself. It does not manifest in a grand, orderly counterstroke, but in 100 desperate, unscripted acts of defiance that collectively form an impenetrable barrier. At the critical crossroads of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division and elements of the 10th Armored Division, surrounded and outnumbered, simply refused to surrender. When presented with a German demand for his capitulation, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's now legendary, laconic reply, "Nuts!" becomes more than a quip. It is a statement of ethos. Cut off from supply, under constant artillery and infantry assault, the defenders of Bastogne hold, buying precious time. Elsewhere, the reaction is the same. At St. Veuve, the 7th Armored Division and scattered units dig in and fight a ferocious delaying action, slowing the northern German spearhead to a crawl. On the Elsenborn Ridge, the U.S. 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, despite being initially pushed back, solidify their positions on high ground and deny the 6th Panzer Army its key northern routes. They do not break. They bend, then freeze into an unyielding wall of steel and flesh. The German offensive, designed for speed and shock, becomes mired in a series of brutal, attritional sieges it cannot afford. The terrain of narrow, icy roads funnels the mighty panzer columns into killing zones where American tank destroyers, bazooka teams, and artillery observers call down devastating fire. The much-maligned M4 Sherman, now upgunned and fighting from hull-down positions, proves a deadly adversary, especially when its superior numbers and faster turret traverse are used to advantage. The American soldier, whom Nazi propaganda depicted as reliant on luxury, now fights in frozen foxholes, short on ammunition and medical supplies, but long on a grim, determined resolve. The ultimate revelation comes with the weather. For days, low clouds and fog had grounded the mighty Allied air forces, a condition the Germans had counted on. But on December 23, the skies clear. From horizon to horizon, the roar of aircraft fills the air. Waves of P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings scream down to strafe and bomb the exposed German columns on the roads. C-47 Dakotas brave flak to drop supplies to Bastogne. The full, horrifying might of Allied aerial supremacy, the product of that paper tiger industrial base, is unleashed. German mobility, the heart of Blitzkrieg, is annihilated on the ground. By Christmas, the offensive is strategically spent. The failed siege of Bastogne, the bloody stalemate at Elsenborn, and the obliteration of their supply lines from the air have drained the Wehrmacht of its last reserves of fuel, equipment, and veteran manpower. The bulge becomes a trap. In early January, Patton's Third Army, having executed a stunning 90-degree turn to the north, crashes into the southern flank of the bulge to relieve Bastogne. The noose tightens. The Ardennes offensive had drained the Wehrmacht of its final strategic reserve. What remained in the west after January 1945 was a hollow shell, a mixture of battered veteran divisions, Volkssturm militia of old men and boys, and foreign conscripts with little will to fight. Against this depleted force advanced an American army that was no longer the green, uncertain force of 1942. It was now a hardened veteran institution, the most powerful mechanized army the world had ever seen. The transformation was total. The lessons of Kasserine, Salerno, and the Normandy hedgerows had been brutally absorbed and institutionalized. Command was more flexible, with generals like Patton, Bradley, and Hodges wielding their corps and divisions with a confident, practiced hand. At the small unit level, the initiative of the junior officer in the NCOs was now a cultivated strength, not a chaotic necessity. The Army had mastered combined arms coordination, the precise integration of infantry, armor, artillery, and, most terrifyingly for the Germans, close air support. A forward observer with a radio could summon a storm of steel from batteries miles away or bring P-47 fighter bombers screeching down onto a single enemy tank within minutes. This tactical prowess was amplified by a logistical reality that beggared German comprehension. The paper tiger industrial base had become an unstoppable river of material. American divisions moved with a standard of supply that seemed like obscene luxury to their adversaries. They were never short of ammunition, rations, fuel, or replacements. When a Sherman tank was destroyed, a new one was often delivered within days. This relentless logistical tide, pouring across the repaired ports and over the Red Ball Express highway system, meant the American army never had to pause. It could maintain a constant, grinding offensive pressure that the crippled German economy and shattered rail network could not hope to withstand. The crossing of the Rhine River in March 1945 became the ultimate symbol of this matured force. Rather than assaulting the prepared defenses head-on, the U.S. First Army seized the intact Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen by stunning, opportunistic action on March 7th. Engineers worked under relentless fire to keep the damaged bridge open, while pontoon bridges were swiftly constructed nearby. Within days, a bridgehead was secured. The last great natural barrier to the heart of Germany had fallen not to a costly set-piece battle, but to speed, initiative, and overwhelming engineer support. Patton's Third Army, not to be outdone, conducted a powerful assault crossing further south at Oppenheim, his troops crossing in assault boats with near indifference to the scattered German resistance. The advance into Germany itself was a campaign of relentless, broad front momentum. German cities, their defenses piecemeal and disorganized, fell one after another. Cologne was taken on March 6th. The industrial heart of the Ruhr was encircled by a vast pincer movement in April, trapping over 300,000 German soldiers in what became known as the Ruhr Pocket. Resistance was often fierce but increasingly fragmented and futile. The myth of the soft American soldier was replaced by a new, grim reality for the German civilian and soldier alike. The army was professional, implacable, and impossibly well supplied. They were not the gangsters of propaganda. They were the mechanics of a vast, efficient war machine. By mid-April, advance elements of the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies had reached the Elbe River, where, by prior agreement with the Soviets, they halted. On April 25, 1945, a patrol from the U.S. 69th Infantry Division met forward elements of the Soviet 58th Guards Rifle Division at Torgau on the Elbe, physically splitting the dying Reich in two. The army Hitler had dismissed as a joke had marched from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany in 11 months, linking hands with the Red Army to seal the Third Reich's fate. April 1945, the Führerbunker, Berlin. 55 feet beneath the Chancellery Garden in a cramped, damp concrete labyrinth, the architect of the catastrophe surveyed his crumbling world. The maps on the Situation Room walls told a tale of irreversible collapse. To the east, the thunder of Soviet artillery was a constant, earth-trembling drumroll. To the west, the front had ceased to exist as a coherent line. It was a series of isolated pockets being methodically reduced by the American and British army. The reports that reached Hitler's desk were fragments of disaster. The Ruhr Pocket surrendered, Munich fallen, Nuremberg taken. Here, in these final claustrophobic days, the reality of his miscalculation became inescapable. The armies he had derided were now dismantling his empire with cold, systematic efficiency. In his manic briefings, he would still clutch at phantom divisions, order counterattacks by units that existed only on paper, and rage against the treachery and incompetence of his general. But the focus of his fury had shifted. The ultimate betrayal, in his twisted logic, was not just military but racial and spiritual. The German people, he ranted to his remaining loyalists like Joseph Goebbels, had proven themselves weak. They had failed the test of history. They did not deserve to survive him. The specific contempt for America morphed into a broader, apocalyptic bitterness. The mongrel society, with its Jewish finance and Negroized culture, had not only fielded a capable army, but had produced the very tools that were obliterating German cities from the air, the B-17 and B-24 bombers of the 8th Air Force. The industrial output he had dismissed had materialized as an avalanche of tanks and trucks that now flooded his homeland. On April 12, the news of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's death briefly sparked a delusional hope in the bunker, a fantasy that a political miracle akin to the miracle of the House of Brandenburg in the 7 Years' War might yet occur. It was a final, pathetic grasp at the intuition he had always trusted over fact. The hope died within days as the Allied advance continued unabated. When the end came on April 30, 1945, it was a surrender not to the Western Allies he had scorned, but to the Slavic Untermenschen of the East he feared and hated most. His suicide was an admission of total defeat, but also a final act of refusing to witness the world his enemies would build, a world where the values of the democracies he considered decadent would reshape Europe. The reckoning for this strategic blindness extended beyond the bunker. It was codified in the dock at the Nuremberg trials, 1945-46. There, the surviving leadership of the Third Reich, men like Hermann Göring, Albert Speer, and Alfred Jodl, sat in the same city that had once hosted their frenzied rallies, now forced to answer for the consequences of their ideology and their war. The prosecution, led by American Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson, systematically laid bare the conspiracy for aggressive war. The staggering scale of the conflict, which the Nazis had believed they could contain and win swiftly, was attributed directly to their actions. In their defenses, a recurring feeble theme emerged. They had underestimated the Allies. They had not believed America could mobilize so quickly. They had not believed the Soviet Union could withstand the initial blow. This was not accepted as an excuse, but entered into the record as evidence of their criminal miscalculation and hubris. The sentences, death and long imprisonment, were a judicial verdict on their regime. But they were also a historical verdict on the catastrophic failure of perception that had led them to war with a coalition whose true strength their racist and ideological lenses could not see. The joke had delivered the punchline, and it was terminal. The story of why Hitler thought the U.S. Army was a joke is more than a historical footnote about misjudgment. It is a case study in the fatal disconnect between ideology and reality, between perceived weakness and latent power. Hitler's contempt was not a simple error. It was a necessary component of his worldview. To acknowledge the United States as a formidable, resilient military power would have been to acknowledge the vitality of the very things Nazism despised: pluralistic democracy, individual initiative, and a free market system capable of astonishing innovation and production. His ideology required America to be weak, so his perception confirmed it. The collision between this belief and the reality of the American war effort reveals a deeper truth about modern conflict. The 20th century demonstrated that the strength of an army is no longer measured solely by the ferocity of its warrior spirit or the brilliance of its founding doctrine, as the Wehrmacht possessed in 1940. Ultimate strength lies in the capacity of a society, its industrial depth, its technological adaptability, its logistical reach, and the resilient, pragmatic courage of its citizen soldiers. The American GI may not have fought for a fanatical creed, but he fought for a concept of home and freedom that proved sufficiently powerful to withstand the frozen hell of the Ardennes and the bloody sands of Normandy. He was supported by a system that could lose 100 tanks and build 1,000 more, that could turn a car factory into an aircraft assembly line in months, that could learn from defeat and adapt faster than its enemy could capitalize on victory. In the end, Hitler's miscalculation was one of time and character. He believed he was fighting the America of 1939, insular, unprepared, and racially impure. He failed to understand that he was forcing a confrontation with the America of 1943 and beyond, a nation unified by purpose, unleashed by necessity, and hardened by battle. The joke, he diagnosed, was a phantom. The punchline, delivered from the beaches of Normandy to the ruins of Berlin, was the sobering reality of a democratic giant, once awakened, whose power to produce, to adapt, and to endure forever changed the calculus of global conflict. The echo of that miscalculation serves as an enduring lesson. To underestimate the resolve and capability of a free people is to invite a catastrophic and final reckoning.